Jaren Vald squinted at the flickering holo screen, as if by sheer willpower he could make the bloody thing less annoying. It was one of those days where everything seemed designed to make him lose his faith in humanity, not that there was much left to begin with. The Endurance creaked ominously around him, a steel leviathan built to ferry the remnants of humanity to a new world, though it often felt more like a prison with a slightly better view. "Look at this," Jaren grumbled, nudging the holo screen with his elbow, as though it had personally offended him. Another masterpiece of ancient bureaucratic gibberish. "If you hate it so much, why read it?" asked his assistant Della, who was sprawled on a nearby chair with the kind of elegance only truly lazy people could muster. "I don't hate it," Jaren said. "I respect it, like I respect a particularly vicious hangover." Della snorted, then went back to her endless game of space solitaire. Jaren turned his attention back to the screen, where lines of text scrolled past like the confessions of a long-dead civilization. He was supposed to be writing the glorious history of the Endurance, a title so full of crap it should have been written in manure. And then he saw it, tilted his head, blinked twice just to be sure that his eyes weren't playing a cruel trick on him. "Well, I'll be damned," Jaren muttered, leaning closer. "What is it?" Della asked without looking up. "A document, looks like some kind of alliance, with the Thrax." Della finally put down her game and glanced over. "The Thrax, those are the ones with the, to put it politely, faces for radio, right?" "The very same," Jaren confirmed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "The Thrax weren't just ugly alien neighbors. They were exiled, the sorts who made our worst look like the kind of people you'd want watching your cat." Della let out a low whistle. "An alliance with them. Sounds like whoever wrote that had a death wish." Jaren nodded, feeling a strange mix of dread and curiosity. Or a very twisted sense of humor. The door to his office hissed open, and in strode Captain Marcus Trant, a man whose presence could be felt even before he entered a room, like a looming debt. "Jaren, Della," he greeted with a nod that implied he had better things to do but was graciously lowering himself to their level. "What brings you to our humble abode, Captain?" Jaren asked, sliding the holo screen toward him. Trant ignored the sarcasm, his eyes scanning the document. As he read, his lips curled into what might have been a smile if you squinted hard enough. "An alliance with the Thrax. Interesting." "Interesting?" Jaren echoed. "It's a bloody disaster waiting to happen." Trant shrugged like a man with nothing to lose, which was probably accurate. "It's history, Vald. The Council will want to know about this." "Oh, I'm sure they'll be thrilled. Nothing like an ancient secret to spice up their petty squabbles." Jaren leaned back, crossing his arms. "But do you really think they're ready to handle something this explosive?" Trant chuckled, a sound like grinding gears. "Ready or not, we don't have a choice. Secrets have a way of exploding whether you're prepared or not." Jaren could only nod, though his gut told him they were all about to step into a very deep, very messy pile of interstellar politics. "Guess it's time to drop this bombshell then. Get ready for the fireworks," Della added with a smirk. The council chamber was a grandiose affair, a reminder of Earth's architectural gaudiness. The room was filled with representatives from every faction aboard the Endurance, because what was a generation ship without a few dozen infighting clans? Jaren stood at the front with Trant, facing the assembled masses. He felt like a man about to deliver the punchline of a joke no one wanted to hear. "Ladies, gentlemen, and others," he began, "I've come across a document of rather intriguing nature." "Get to the point, Vald," snapped Counselor Myra Bell, a woman whose resting face could stop a clock. "Patience, Myra," Jaren said, savoring the anticipation. "It seems we had an alliance with the Thrax." The room exploded into chaos, voices raised in disbelief, anger, and in a few cases, laughter. "An alliance with those bug-eyed bastards," one representative shouted. "It's madness," another exclaimed. "Actually, it seems quite well thought out," Jaren interjected, loving the pandemonium a bit too much. "A masterpiece of diplomacy, really." Myra Bell stood, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "This is no laughing matter. An alliance with the Thrax could have serious implications." "Oh, I agree," Jaren replied, his tone light. "The implications are endless, mostly involving our grisly demise." Captain Trant cleared his throat and the room fell silent. "We need to consider the potential benefits. The Thrax may be unsavory, but they have resources we lack." "Like what?" someone sneered. "Advanced ugliness." Trant ignored the jab. "They have technology, information. Things we could use." Or, Jaren added, "they could use us as a convenient snack." The debate raged on, voices clashing like swords, but Jaren sensed the tide was turning. Fear and desperation had a way of making even the most outrageous ideas seem plausible. Finally, Myra Bell spoke again, her tone weary but resolute. "We must make a decision. Do we pursue this alliance or bury it like the others before us?" Jaren glanced around the room at faces twisted with uncertainty and determination. He knew what choice they'd make. They were all gamblers at heart. "I say we roll the dice," he murmured, just loud enough for Della to hear. She smiled, a wicked gleam in her eye. "Well, Jaren, guess we'll see if this gamble pays off, assuming we survive the fallout." As the council descended into further debate, Jaren leaned back, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. He'd opened a door and now there was no turning back. "Here's to new alliances," he whispered to himself, though he suspected they might just be the beginning of the end. The meeting dragged on, as meetings tend to do when the stakes involve possible extermination. Yet, despite the gravity of the situation, Jaren found himself oddly detached, as if watching a tragic play with the morbid curiosity of someone who knew the ending would be spectacularly disastrous. When the council finally adjourned, Jaren and Della wandered back to their quarters, the corridors of endurance dimly lit, as if the ship itself was trying to conserve energy for the inevitable shitstorm. "Do you think they'll go through with it?" Della asked, her voice echoing in the empty halls. "Oh, absolutely," Jaren replied with a chuckle. "They are idiots, but they are our idiots. Besides, who can resist poking a hornet's nest?" Della laughed, a sound that made the metallic walls seem a little less oppressive. "And here I thought historians were supposed to be impartial." "Impartiality is for the dead," Jaren replied. "The living have a responsibility to mock the absurdity of it all." They reached Jaren's quarters and he paused, looking at Della with a rare moment of sincerity. "You know, if this goes south, we might not get another chance to enjoy the little things." "Like what?" Della asked, cocking an eyebrow. "Like the taste of recycled air, the gentle hum of struggling engines, the luxury of a lukewarm nutrient paste." Della laughed again, and Jaren realized it was the most honest sound he'd heard in a long time. "Here's to the little things," she said, raising an imaginary glass. Jaren mimicked the gesture. "To the little things." They parted ways, but Jaren couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. He lay in his bunk, staring at the dull ceiling, wondering what the hell he'd just set in motion. Somewhere out there, the Thrax were waiting, and Jaren could only hope they'd be in a good mood when humanity came calling. But as sleep finally took him, he had a sneaking suspicion that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The Endurance's journey was anything but smooth, and as Jaren drifted off, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, they'd bitten off more than they could chew. Yet in the end, what was life without a little risk? As the ship sailed through the endless void, one thing was certain: the game was on, and the stakes had never been higher. The Endurance was like a floating asylum, a ship full of people who should have been given a one-way ticket to nowhere and told to enjoy the ride. And now, thanks to Jaren Vald's little discovery, they had a new complication to add to the mix: an ancient alliance with the Thrax. Jaren could almost feel the ship groaning under the weight of such cosmic irony. Here they were, trying to keep the peace between factions who'd argue over the proper way to tie shoelaces. And now they had to worry about an alien race whose idea of diplomacy probably involved sharp objects and regrettable decisions. He found himself in a cramped meeting room that had all the charm of a janitor's closet, trying to mediate between the different factions who'd gathered to scream at each other. The representatives were seated around a table that might have been elegant once, but now looked like it had been salvaged from a scrapyard. Jaren sat at the head of the table, playing the part of the reluctant referee. Della lounged in a corner, half watching the spectacle unfold while fiddling with her holo screen. "Why are we even considering this?" demanded Counselor Myra Bell, her voice like a buzzsaw cutting through the chatter. "We need to focus on getting to our new home, not playing nice with aliens who probably want to wear our skins as hats." A representative from the Engineers Guild, a man who looked like he hadn't seen daylight in years, leaned forward. "Because we need resources, Myra. The Thrax have technology that could make our journey a hell of a lot easier. We don't know what they want in return," Myra shot back, her eyes narrowing. "And I, for one, am not interested in finding out the hard way." Jaren cleared his throat, attempting to sound authoritative. "Look, we all know the risks, but if we can somehow, I dunno, not piss them off, maybe we stand a chance of getting something out of this." The room erupted into a cacophony of arguments, each representative trying to outshout the others. It was like listening to a group of toddlers argue over whose turn it was to play with the last toy. Jaren sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, enough. We've got to present a united front here, or we're going to look like an all-you-can-eat buffet for the Thrax." The door slid open with a hiss, and Captain Marcus Trant strode in, his presence like a gust of stale air cutting through the room's chaos. "Status report," he snapped, glancing at Jaren. "We're just hammering out the details," Jaren said, which was a polite way of saying they were bickering like an old married couple in the middle of a divorce. Trant nodded and turned his attention to the assembled representatives. "Listen up. We've picked up a signal on our long-range sensors. It's Thrax, and it's heading our way." The room fell silent, the only sound the nervous shifting of people in their seats. "How long do we have?" Myra asked, her voice tight with barely contained tension. "About a day, maybe less," Trant replied. "Which means we need to make a decision, and fast." Jaren felt a pit open in his stomach. They were running out of time, and the last thing they needed was a diplomatic incident with the Thrax showing up unannounced. He glanced at Della, who was still absorbed in her game, seemingly unfazed by the impending alien visitation. "Della, any chance you could, stop playing and help out here?" Jaren asked, sarcasm lacing his words. She looked up, smirking. "What, and miss all this fun? But fine, since you asked so nicely." "Appreciated," Jaren muttered, turning back to the debate at hand. "We need to establish contact," Trant said, his tone brokering no argument. "Find out what they want before they get here. Assuming they don't just show up and shoot us out of the sky," the engineer added helpfully. Jaren rolled his eyes. "Thanks for the vote of confidence. All right, let's figure out a plan. We need to keep them talking long enough to negotiate. Or long enough for them to decide we're not worth the trouble," Della added, her voice dry. "Exactly," Jaren said, ignoring the fact that she was probably right. "Let's see if we can't charm them with our dazzling personalities." The representatives reluctantly agreed to work together, and soon they were hammering out the details of their plan. It was a patchwork effort, held together by duct tape and wishful thinking, but it was better than nothing. As they finalized their approach, Jaren couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope over a pit of hungry Thrax. One wrong step, and they'd all end up as interstellar hors d'oeuvres. The following day arrived with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Jaren found himself standing on the bridge of the Endurance, surrounded by a team of nervous officers and the ever-present Captain Trant. "Everything ready, Vald?" Trant asked, his tone clipped. "As ready as we'll ever be," Jaren replied, feeling like a man about to dive headfirst into a pool of sharks. Della was at a nearby console, fiddling with the holo screen. "Let's hope they're in a chatty mood," she said. "And not a let's disembowel the human's mood." Jaren chuckled, though it came out more like a strangled gasp. "Yeah, fingers crossed." The tension on the bridge was palpable, a living thing that wrapped around them all like a constrictor. And then, just when Jaren thought he might suffocate from the anticipation, the Thrax ship appeared on the main view screen. It was an ugly thing, all angles and spikes, like a piece of abstract art that someone had decided would make a good weapon. Jaren couldn't help but admire the sheer audacity of its design, as if the Thrax had set out to create a ship that screamed, "We're not here to make friends." "Open a channel," Trant ordered, his voice steady despite the situation. The communications officer complied, and moments later, the visage of a Thrax filled the screen. It was every bit as unpleasant as Jaren had imagined, a face that seemed to be perpetually snarling, with eyes like twin black holes that swallowed the light. "Greetings, humans," the Thrax said, its voice a guttural whisper that sent shivers down Jaren's spine. "I am Zelcher, envoy of the Thrax Dominion." "Greetings, Zelcher," Trant replied, his tone as diplomatic as he could muster. "I am Captain Marcus Trant of the Endurance. We welcome you to our humble abode." Zelcher inclined its head, a gesture that might have been a nod or a prelude to an attack for all Jaren knew. "We have received your message concerning the Ancient Alliance. We are intrigued." "Intrigued is good," Jaren muttered under his breath. "Intrigued means they haven't decided to kill us yet." "Indeed," Zelcher continued, its gaze sweeping across the bridge as if appraising their worth. "We wish to discuss the terms of our agreement. May we come aboard?" Jaren exchanged a glance with Della, who arched an eyebrow. What could possibly go wrong? Trant cleared his throat. "Of course, we would be honored to host you. We will prepare to receive you shortly." "Very well," Zelcher said, its lips curling into what might have been a smile or a baring of teeth. "We shall await your signal." The screen went dark, leaving the bridge in silence. Jaren let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," he said, "that went better than expected." "Yeah, but the hard part's just beginning," Della reminded him. Trant turned to his officers. "Prepare the docking bay for our guests, and make sure security is at the ready." As the crew scrambled to make preparations, Jaren felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was it, their chance to either forge a new path or crash and burn spectacularly. The stakes had never been higher. "Let's hope they have good manners," Della quipped as they made their way to the docking bay. "Manners, right?" Jaren replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "That's what I'm worried about." They arrived just in time to see the Thrax shuttle dock with the Endurance. The bay doors hissed open and two Thrax stepped out, their armor glinting in the harsh lights. "Welcome aboard," Jaren said, forcing a smile. Zelcher inclined its head again. "Lead the way, human." Jaren and Della led the Thrax through the ship's corridors, their armored footsteps echoing ominously. As they walked, Jaren couldn't help but notice the curious stares of the crew, each one a reminder of the precarious situation they were in. They reached the meeting room, where Trant and the representatives waited. Jaren took his place at the table, trying to project an air of calm authority. Zelcher regarded them with an inscrutable gaze. "Let us begin," it said, its voice carrying the weight of ages. The negotiations that followed were tense, an intricate dance of diplomacy and deceit. Jaren found himself playing the role of mediator yet again, struggling to keep the representatives focused on the task at hand. "And how do we know you won't just take what you want and leave us in the dust?" Myra demanded, her skepticism evident. Zelcher's eyes glittered with dark amusement. "We have no interest in your destruction, human. Our goals align, at least for now." "Comforting," Della muttered, earning a sharp look from Jaren. The discussion continued, each side probing for weaknesses and opportunities. Despite the stakes, Jaren couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Humans and aliens sitting across from one another trying to negotiate a future that might never come to pass. As the talks wore on, Jaren felt the tension ease ever so slightly. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. "Very well," Zelcher said finally, its tone grudgingly respectful. "We shall consider your proposal. But be warned, should you betray us, the consequences will be dire." "Understood," Trant replied, matching the alien's intensity. "We'll be in touch." With that, the Thrax rose, their departure as swift as their arrival had been. Jaren let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the world lift if only a little. "Well," Della said, her voice light with relief. "That wasn't so bad." Jaren chuckled, though exhaustion tugged at him. "No, it wasn't, but let's not count our chickens just yet." Trant nodded, his usual stern demeanor softened by a hint of gratitude. "Good work, Vald. Now let's see if we can keep this ship from falling apart." As they watched the Thrax shuttle depart, Jaren felt a flicker of hope amid the chaos. They'd managed to hold things together for now, but the future remained uncertain. And as long as they were adrift in the endless void, that uncertainty would be their constant companion. But here, amidst the madness, they had each other and the strength to face whatever came next. And sometimes in the vastness of space, that was all you could ask for. Jaren Vald stood there, half drunk on adrenaline, half on pure dread. The Thrax had left, but now they were stuck between a rock and a hard Thrax. Not a good place to be when the rock is an ancient alliance that nobody really wants, and the Thrax are, well, the Thrax. "Great," Myra Bell grumbled, the counselor's voice as flat as the horizon on a barren moon. "Now we're officially screwed with a capital S. Wouldn't be the endurance if we weren't constantly teetering on the edge of disaster," Della quipped, her fingers gliding over her holo screen, likely back to her endless space solitaire. Jaren shook his head, feeling the weight of leadership squeezing his temples like a vice. "Look, we've got to figure out how to make this work. The last thing we need is the Thrax deciding our innards would look better on the outside." Trant, ever the captain with a heart of stone, folded his arms and leaned back, his chair groaning under the weight of his disapproval. "So what's the plan, Vald? You gonna charm them with a song and dance?" "Only if the dance involves running in the opposite direction," Jaren shot back. "But seriously, we need to find some common ground fast." The meeting room was a stifling box of recycled air and distrust, the kind of place where you'd expect to find a broom and a forgotten mop rather than the future of humanity being hashed out. The Engineers Guild representative, a man with more grease on his hands than skin, cleared his throat. "We need their tech." "It's not just a want, it's a need," he said, eyes shifting nervously. "Our systems are being held together by hope and a hell of a lot of prayers. We're one engine failure away from turning into cosmic debris." "Isn't that a cheery thought?" Della mused, raising an eyebrow. "Bet the recruitment posters aren't mentioning that little tidbit." Jaren rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of a headache. "All right, priority one. Convince them we're not a waste of time. We play nice, make them feel warm and fuzzy about this ancient alliance nonsense. And if they decide they want something more than handshakes and kumbayas," Myra asked, skepticism dripping from every word. "Then we hope we're faster runners than we are diplomats," Jaren replied, half serious. "But let's try charm before sprinting for lifeboats." As the meeting broke up, the factions left with all the enthusiasm of condemned prisoners heading to the gallows. Jaren lingered, staring at the empty seats, wondering how he'd managed to get roped into this gig. "They're scared, Jaren," Della said, not looking up from her holo screen. "Hell, I'm scared too, and I find this whole situation hilarious." "Yeah, terror and comedy, the classic double act," Jaren muttered. "Looks like we're headlining." The Endurance, for all its grandeur as a vessel of human hope, felt more like a cosmic joke, a punchline in the making. As he roamed the metal corridors, Jaren could almost hear the ship itself whispering, "You're going to die here," with every creak and groan. The next few days felt like a slow crawl through purgatory. The Thrax demands loomed like storm clouds over the ship, and Jaren found himself mediating between factions that would rather stab each other with sporks than cooperate. Nothing like impending doom to bring out the best in people. The Engineers Guild was particularly vocal, and Jaren found himself in their workshop-cum-graveyard for obsolete tech, a place that smelled of burnt circuits and desperation. "So," Jaren began, as diplomatically as he could muster, "what's the real story here? Are we as screwed as everyone's acting?" "We're holding together," the chief engineer said, wiping oil-stained hands on his overalls. But one wrong move and the whole system could go tits up. That's why we need the Thrax tech. Just a minor existential crisis then, Jaren said, trying to keep the mood light enough to float. No biggie. Exactly, the engineer replied, deadpan. Nothing we can't handle unless, the laws of physics decide to quit on us. Jaren left the workshop with a better understanding of just how precarious their situation was. The Endurance wasn't just drifting through space. It was limping along with a bullet in its side, hoping to make it to a hospital before it bled out. He made his way to the observatory, a quiet place where the stars felt close enough to touch. Della was there, gazing out at the cosmos with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and cynicism. "Thought I'd find you here," Jaren said, stepping beside her. "It's the best reality show in the universe," she replied, gesturing to the endless void. "No writers, just chaos and entropy. Bet the ratings are through the roof," Jaren joked. Della shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe some big cosmic entity is watching us right now, laughing their ass off," Jaren sighed. "Makes you wonder if we're just puppets in someone else's dark comedy. If we are, I hope they're enjoying the show," Della said, her voice softening. "Because we're giving one hell of a performance." Their moment of quiet contemplation was interrupted by a chime from Jaren's comms. The Thrax wanted to talk. "Here we go," Jaren muttered, as they made their way to the bridge for round 2 of Let's Make a Deal or Die Trying. Zelcher was waiting on the screen, that sinister grin, or was it a grimace, still fixed in place. "We have considered your position," the Thrax envoy began, "and we have decided to honor the ancient alliance." Jaren blinked, taken aback. "Well, that was easier than expected." Zelcher's eyes narrowed as if Jaren had said the magic words to open the trapdoor beneath his feet. "But there are conditions." "Of course there are," Jaren sighed. "Nothing comes for free, right? Our technology will aid you, but in return, you must assist us in a matter of great importance." Jaren's instincts screamed at him to retreat, but he forced himself to listen. "And that would be, we require your assistance in retrieving an artifact from a derelict star system. It is vital to our people." Jaren exchanged a look with Della, who had resumed her game. "An artifact sounds simple." "Simple would be an overstatement," Zelcher said, their voice thick with irony. "The system is unstable, highly dangerous." "Naturally," Jaren replied, feeling the familiar weight of impending doom settle back on his shoulders. "We'll need to discuss this with our leaders." "Do so quickly," Zelcher said, their image flickering before disappearing entirely. Jaren turned to Trant, who was frowning, a sure sign that he was thinking deeply or suffering indigestion. "Thoughts, Captain?" Trant shrugged. "We need their tech. We don't have much choice, but a dangerous system. Like we had a choice in the first place," Della chimed in, not looking up. "This is the universe's way of saying screw you with a smile." Jaren sighed, knowing full well what this meant. "All right, let's gather the council." The meeting room, when filled with the council members, felt even smaller, like a can of highly opinionated sardines. Jaren laid out the Thrax proposal, watching for reactions. "Unacceptable," Myra said immediately. "We can't send people into harm's way on a whim." The engineer's representative leaned forward. "We need this. Without their tech, we're just marking time until something fails permanently." "What if it's a trap?" Myra argued, her voice growing heated. "Then it's a very elaborate one," Jaren replied dryly. "Look, I know it's risky, but we're already living on borrowed time. If we can't keep this ship running." The silence that followed was heavy, each person lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. Eventually, Trant broke it. "Let's put it to a vote," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. The vote was close, too close for comfort, but in the end, necessity won out. Jaren felt a grim satisfaction mixed with dread. They were committed now, for better or worse. After the meeting, Jaren found Della leaning against the wall, a smirk playing on her lips. "Congratulations, you're officially leading a suicide mission." Jaren chuckled despite himself. "Couldn't have done it without you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, straightening up. "Save it for when we're not all dead." "Fair point," Jaren said, looking out at the stars. Let's just hope the Thrax are better allies than enemies. The preparations began with a flurry of activity. The Endurance was a hive of organized chaos, each crew member playing their part in the grand theater of survival. Jaren found himself everywhere, a ghost floating through the ship, overseeing, encouraging, occasionally threatening with a dark grin. "How's it going?" he asked the chief engineer, who was neck-deep in a console panel. "We're doing what we can," the engineer replied, not looking up. "If the Thrax tech is as good as they say, we might just make it. But you'd rather not test that theory," Jaren said. The engineer snorted. "I'm not in the business of gambling, but here we are." As the crew prepared for the task ahead, Jaren couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stepped into something far above their pay grade. It was always the same, humans, dabbling with things they didn't understand, hoping for the best and usually meeting the worst. Della caught up with him in the corridors, her holo screen tucked under one arm. "So, what's next, fearless leader?" "Next, we head into the great unknown," Jaren said. "And hope we come out the other side with more than just a good story." She smiled, a rare thing that made the darkness of their situation seem a little less oppressive. "Well, if anyone can pull this off, it's us, or we die trying." "Here's to not dying," Jaren said, raising an imaginary glass. "To not dying," Della echoed, clinking her own invisible drink. Together they headed towards the hangar, where the crew was preparing for what could either be their greatest triumph or their final voyage. The stakes couldn't be higher, but Jaren felt a strange sense of calm. In the chaos of the universe, they had each other, and that was something. As the Endurance's engines roared to life, Jaren looked out at the stars, the endless void that held both their doom and their salvation. Humanity had always been about reaching for the stars, despite knowing that one day those same stars might just reach back. And now, standing on the precipice, Jaren realized that the future was as unpredictable as it was inevitable. They were the architects of their fate, for better or worse. In the end, what more could you ask for? Jaren sat hunched over a holo screen in the Endurance's archives, an ancient library of digital dust and dubious hope. The place smelled like a combination of stale breath and broken dreams, which was fitting since it was often used as a refuge for the desperate and the damned. "Find anything useful?" Della asked, materializing beside him with the grace of a lurking cat. "That depends. If you're in the market for recipes on how to cook with algae, then yes," Jaren replied, his eyes scanning the screen. "Otherwise, not so much." Della leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the ancient text. "Did you know there are 15 different ways to turn algae into soup? And all of them taste like despair. Sounds like the chefs have their work cut out for them," Jaren said, clicking through pages of irrelevant data. "If we survive this, I might start a blog called Cooking with Crisis." "Wouldn't be short on material," Della quipped. She glanced around the archives, shelves teetering with digital tablets like they might collapse and bury them in obsolete data. "You sure there's nothing here about the Thrax artifact?" Jaren snorted. "If I knew what I was looking for, I'd be a damn sight closer to finding it." The Thrax weapon had been a stroke of rotten luck. During one of the many routine checks in the archives, some overeager engineer had poked the wrong thing, and now they had a ticking time bomb on their hands. It was an ancient piece of Thrax tech, and after half the crew had nearly wet themselves trying to figure out what it did, they concluded it did a whole lot of something bad. "Maybe we should fix a sign. 'Do not touch might explode,'" Della suggested. "You'd think it'd be common sense," Jaren said, shaking his head. "But you'd be surprised how many people lack that particular gene." Just then the door hissed open, and Trant walked in, his usual storm cloud of skepticism following close behind. "I hear we have a new toy," he said, crossing his arms. "Yeah, but it's more like a surprise package from your least favorite relative," Jaren replied, swiveling around to face him. "The kind that explodes in your face," Trant grunted. "And here I thought we'd finally catch a break." "That'd be too easy," Della said. "The universe loves to remind us we're its favorite playthings." "So, what's the plan?" Trant asked, ever the practical one. "Get the Thrax to disarm it," Jaren suggested, half joking. "But short of that, pray it doesn't blow us to kingdom come." Trant frowned, deep lines etching into his forehead like a roadmap to nowhere. "I was hoping for something more concrete than prayer." Jaren threw up his hands. "Unless you've got a manual on ancient Thrax tech, this is as concrete as it gets." Della tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Maybe we could bluff it. Tell the Thrax we have their little doomsday device and see if they play nice. Or they decide to play rough," Trant countered, ever the realist. Before the conversation could spiral into an abyss of despair, a chime echoed, followed by a voice from the comms, Counselor Myra Bell. "Captain Vald," she said, her voice flat as ever, like she'd been practicing sounding uninterested. "We need you in the meeting room immediately." "Ah, the box of despair calls," Jaren muttered, standing up. "Shall we?" In the meeting room, a space that felt more like purgatory with every visit, the factions were already squabbling. The tension was thicker than the recycled air and just as unpleasant. "We can't just sit on this bomb and hope it doesn't go off," shouted the engineer's representative, his face shiny with the sheen of stress. "We need to act." "And do what?" Myra snapped back. "Hand it over to the Thrax, hoping they'll play nice." "Considering our options, I'd say that's our best bet," the engineer argued, grease-stained fingers drumming against the table. Jaren cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. "We need to consider that any action could make things worse. If we handle this wrong, we might trigger it ourselves." "Then what do you propose?" Myra said, her gaze cold enough to freeze a sun. "We negotiate," Jaren replied. "But not like amateurs, we need leverage." "And pray tell, what leverage do we have?" Myra asked, her words dripping with skepticism. "We've got their fancy toy," Jaren said with a grin. "I'm betting they don't want us fiddling with it any more than we want it to go off." "That assumes they care," Trant interjected. "For all we know, they could be hoping it takes us out." "Yeah," Della added, "but if there's even a chance it means something to them, it's our best shot." Silence fell over the room as they weighed the slim odds. Jaren felt like a gambler betting his last credit on a hand of cards dealt by a blind dealer. "All right," Myra conceded grudgingly. "But if this backfires, it's on you, Jaren." "Isn't it always?" Jaren said with a shrug, standing to leave. "Now if you'll excuse me, I've got some aliens to sweet-talk." As the meeting broke up, Jaren found himself once again with Della in tow. They headed to the bridge, where the comms team was already setting up a call with the Thrax. "Ready to charm the scales off them?" Della asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Like a snake charmer with a death wish," Jaren replied, taking his seat. He took a deep breath as the screen flickered on, revealing the unsettling visage of Zelcher once more. "Ah, Captain Vald," Zelcher said, their voice as slippery as ever. "We were wondering when we'd hear from you." "I bet you were," Jaren said, his own voice steady. "Seems we've got something of yours." Zelcher's eyes narrowed, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. "Do you now?" "An old piece of Thrax tech," Jaren continued. "Seems it wants to go off like the 4th of July. The Thrax envoy's expression was unreadable, alien features betraying nothing. "And you wish for our assistance, I assume." Jaren leaned back, forcing a casual confidence he didn't quite feel. "We'd appreciate it. In exchange, we're willing to negotiate." There was a long pause during which Jaren could almost hear the grinding of alien thoughts. Finally, Zelcher spoke. "We will assist. But first, you must fulfill your part of the agreement. Retrieve the artifact, right?" Jaren said, feeling the noose of obligation tighten. "Just as soon as this device is secured." "Very well," Zelcher agreed, their image flickering slightly. "Prepare to transmit data. We will provide instructions." As the call ended, Della whistled low. "Well, they didn't bite our heads off. That's progress." "Progress," Jaren echoed. "Feels more like we just kicked a nest of vipers and asked them not to sting." "Optimism, Jaren," Della chided with a grin. "Try it sometime." "Yeah, I could use a change," Jaren said, rubbing his temples. "Right after I learned not to volunteer for suicide missions." With the Thrax instructions in hand, the crew moved quickly, every member a cog in the vast, clanking machine of survival. Jaren watched as the Engineers Guild pored over the data, their greasy hands now busy with the intricate dance of life and death. "Think they know what they're doing?" Della asked, watching the Ursets ballet. "They better," Jaren replied, "or we'll all find out just how quick you can be vaporized." The minutes ticked by, each second stretching out like a silent scream. Jaren paced the bridge, feeling the weight of every decision, every possible catastrophe. Finally, the chief engineer emerged from the tangle of wires and blinking lights, looking like he'd fought a war and barely survived. "It's done," he said, more exhaustion than triumph in his voice. Jaren nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and residual dread. "Let's hope the Thrax keep their word." "Hope," Della said, sidling up to him. "It's a dangerous thing." "Yeah," Jaren agreed, looking out at the stars. "But sometimes it's all we've got." With the immediate threat dealt with, Jaren knew it was only a temporary respite. The real challenge lay ahead in the derelict star system and whatever horrors it held. But for now they had a chance, a fragile, flickering chance to survive. "Let's get ready," Jaren said, squaring his shoulders and feeling the weight of leadership settle back on him like a familiar old coat. "Ready for what?" Della asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. "For whatever the universe throws at us next," Jaren replied, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "And hope we come out swinging." As the ship hummed with the subdued energy of preparation, Jaren took one last look at the archive room. It was strange how a place filled with the past could hold the key to their future. "Hey, Jaren," Della called, motioning him to follow. "Let's go save humanity, one crisis at a time." "After you," Jaren said, gesturing grandly. Ladies first in the face of doom. Together, they walked away from the remnants of old knowledge and stepped back into the chaos of the present, ready to face whatever came next with sarcasm, stubbornness, and a hope only slightly singed around the edges. The Endurance, humanity's last hope, felt more like an overcrowded asylum than a spaceship. It was a place where hope and despair were playing a never-ending game of cat and mouse. And just as you'd think hope had won, despair would come out swinging with a sucker punch. Jaren Vald, nominal captain of this tin can, was now juggling a Thrax artifact that made everyone feel like they were sitting on a ticking bomb. And that wasn't the worst of it. The factions aboard were on the verge of tearing each other apart, their patience thinner than the recycled oxygen keeping them alive. "Did you hear?" Della sauntered up beside Jaren with a casual grace that managed to mock the chaos around them. Counselor Myra Bell tried convincing the Engineering Guild to double-check the Thrax instructions. "You know, just in case we missed the part about how to blow up the universe." Jaren snorted, glancing toward the screens displaying increasingly frantic messages from different corners of the ship. "Trust Myra to see a crack in the pavement and declare an earthquake. She does have a way of finding the silver lining in a mushroom cloud," Della mused, her fingers tapping idly on her data pad, which was probably still running Space Solitaire. "Or maybe she just likes watching things burn. Seems like everyone and their grandmother has an opinion on how to handle this mess," Jaren said, scanning the latest report from the Engineers Guild. "And none of them agree." The tension aboard the ship was a palpable entity, lurking around corners and whispering in anxious ears. The Endurance was a pressure cooker ready to blow, and Jaren wasn't keen on being the meat in the stew when it happened. He walked into the archives, where silence reigned like a disgruntled king. It was here, amidst the digital dust of forgotten human achievements, that he hoped to find a solution, something, anything, to deactivate the Thrax weapon without groveling at their alien feet. "Ah, the land of lost causes and outdated tech," Jaren muttered to himself, perching on a stool as he accessed the holo screen. Flicking through the archives, he found himself staring at schematics older than the combined ages of everyone on the ship. There it was, a glimmer of hope in the form of a dusty old blueprint that looked promising. It was a piece of human ingenuity, ironically overlooked in humanity's desperate scramble for survival. The device, if it could even be called that, was a primitive but potentially effective way to neutralize alien tech, or at least that's what the notes seemed to suggest. Son of a, Jaren began, eyes wide. This might actually work. He needed to get this to the engineers. But convincing them, and more importantly, the factions, to give a rat's ass about a rusty old plan was another issue. They were like cats, aloof and more likely to scratch you than give you a straight answer. Jaren found himself back in that claustrophobic meeting room, the air thick with distrust. Counselor Myra Bell glared across the table, her eyes daring him to say something stupid. "All right," Jaren started, holding up the holo screen. "I've found something in the archives. It's a piece of old human tech that could counteract the Thrax device, silence, the kind that bore holes into your skull. And you think this will work?" Trans skepticism could have powered the ship for a year. "It's a long shot," Jaren admitted. "But it's a shot." "Another gamble," Myra snapped, her voice sharper than a scalpel. "That's all you seem to offer us." Jaren sighed, his patience worn thinner than Myra's goodwill. "Look, we can either try this or wait for the Thrax to decide we're better off vaporized. Your choice." The Engineers Guild representative, grease-stained and gaunt, leaned forward. "I'm willing to give it a shot, but we'll need cooperation. This isn't something we can slap together in a closet." "Cooperation," Myra mocked. "Good luck. We're one argument away from splitting this ship in half." "Maybe," Jaren said evenly. "But if we don't work together, there won't be a ship left to argue on." Della piped in, her voice oddly reassuring. "Let's face it, folks. This is our best chance, and if it fails, well, at least we tried. Nothing like going out with a bang, right?" A grim chuckle rippled through the room. Even Myra wore a reluctant smirk. "All right," Myra relented, albeit reluctantly. "Let's hear your plan, Jaren. It better be good." "Step 1 is getting everyone to stop trying to throttle each other long enough to focus," Jaren said, glancing around. "Step 2 is the engineers actually putting this together without killing us all in the process." "And Step 3, Tran asked, arms crossed. "Step 3, Jaren said with a wry smile, "is hoping it doesn't blow up in our faces." The meeting ended with a consensus as fragile as a bubble in a thorn bush. But it was something. Jaren watched as the representatives filed out, each with their own brand of cynicism and reluctant hope. "So, when do we start building this miracle contraption?" Della asked, falling into step beside him. "Yesterday," Jaren replied. "But I'll settle for right now." The engineering bay buzzed with frenetic energy. Jaren stood by as the Engineers Guild pored over the schematics, translating outdated technology into something usable. It was a grim ballet of soldering, cursing, and praying to gods long since forgotten. "Think they have a clue?" Della asked, watching the organized chaos with detached amusement. "I sure hope so," Jaren said, "because if they don't, we're all in for a very short trip." Hours turned into eternities as the engineers worked. Jaren could feel the tension in the air, a taut string ready to snap at the slightest misstep. "Captain," the chief engineer called, his face smeared with the grime of desperation and determination. "We're making progress, but we need one more thing, power." "A lot of it. We'll have to divert from non-essential systems," Jaren said, already anticipating the protests. "I'll handle the fallout," he turned to Della. "Let's rally the troops. The more hands, the better chance we have." Della saluted, a playful glint in her eye. "On it, Captain." Jaren watched her go, feeling the weight of leadership like a chain around his neck. It was funny how responsibility never felt heavy until you tried to take it off. By the time the message went out for volunteers, Jaren was ready to drop. The Endurance was teetering, the factions restless and suspicious. He needed them to pull together, even if it was by sheer force of will. The makeshift construction site took over a corner of the bay, tools and parts creating a miniature labyrinth. Jaren moved through it, offering encouragement, cracking jokes, anything to keep spirits from sinking. "Remind me," Della said, joining him once more. "Why did we sign up for this again?" "Masochism, probably," Jaren replied, surveying the work. "And a bad sense of adventure. Or maybe because we were the only ones stupid enough to think we could make a difference." "Yeah, Jaren said, feeling a flicker of pride amidst the exhaustion. Or maybe just stubborn enough. The Iors dragged on, a blur of sweat and nerves. Jaren paced like a caged animal, his mind a carousel of what-ifs. Finally, the chief engineer signaled. "It's ready." "As ready as it'll ever be," Jaren nodded, a strange calm settling over him. "All right, let's do this." The device, a clunky amalgamation of human ingenuity and desperation, was hooked into the ship's systems. Jaren felt like he was watching a fireworks display with a front-row ticket to annihilation. "All systems go," the engineer confirmed, his voice tight. Jaren took a deep breath. "Let's light it up." The device whirred to life, a low hum that vibrated through the floor. Jaren held his breath, watching the readouts, waiting for the universe to decide their fate. "Captain," a voice from the comms crackled. "We're getting a response. The Thrax device, it's deactivating." A cheer erupted, a sound of raw, unfiltered relief. "Looks like your long shot paid off," Della said, her grin wide and infectious. "Yeah," Jaren replied, feeling the crushing weight of relief. For once, the universe decided to give us a break. The threat was neutralized, but the scars remained. The factions, while momentarily united, still bore the marks of distrust. Jaren knew it would take more than a close call to bridge those divides. But for now, they had time. Time to heal, time to prepare, and maybe, just maybe, time to learn. "What's next, Captain?" Della asked, elbowing him. "Next," Jaren echoed, looking out at the stars. "We find that damn Thrax artifact for Zelcher, make sure they keep their end of the deal. And after that, who knows," Jaren said, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Maybe we finally find that new world we've been chasing." He felt the familiar weight settle back, but this time it was a little lighter, a little more bearable. "Until then, we keep fighting," Jaren said, the words a promise, a vow to himself and to those who trusted him. Della nodded, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Together." "Together," Jaren agreed, feeling the certainty in that single word. In a universe that seemed hell-bent on their destruction, they were still here, still fighting, still hoping. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now. Jaren stared at the holo-screen as if sheer willpower could make the digital scribbles dance into a coherent solution. The engineers buzzed around him, a swarm of frustration and profanity, while Della leaned against a bulkhead, her data pad forgotten for once. "You really think this might work?" she asked, a smirk playing on her lips like a cat toying with a mouse. "About as likely as the universe deciding we deserve a break," Jaren replied, eyes still glued to the display. "But I'm an optimist," Della snorted. "Optimist? You. You've been reading your own press clippings again." "Have to remind myself I'm not completely useless," Jaren said, flicking through schematics that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all the good they did him. The engineers' grumbling crescendoed as they wrestled with outdated tech like ancient knights jousting with windmills. Jaren knew the real battle wasn't against the Thrax tech, but against the apathy and disdain simmering among his own people. It didn't help that the Endurance was a hotbed of mistrust, each faction eyeing the others like they were deciding who to eat first when the food ran out. Counselor Myra Bell stormed in, her expression as warm as an ice planet. "How's your miracle coming along, Jaren?" Slowly. "I thought we'd have it done by breakfast, but lunch might be more realistic," he said, knowing fully well the engineers needed more than just time to pull this off. "And how do you plan to keep this ship from tearing itself apart in the meantime?" Myra demanded, crossing her arms like she was about to take him to court. "Bribery, blackmail, maybe a well-timed napalm bath," Jaren suggested with a grin that was more teeth than humor, always with the jokes. "I think if you were going down with the ship, you'd still be laughing," Myra said, shaking her head. "It's either laugh or scream at this point, and I like my vocal cords intact," Jaren replied. As the conversation lulled, a shout erupted from the engineering pit. The chief engineer, a man whose dedication was only matched by his penchant for colorful language, was waving a wrench like it was a sword. "We've got a problem, just one," Della quipped, pushing off the wall to join Jaren as they headed into the fray. "Sabotage," the engineer spat, pointing to a mess of wires that looked like they'd been attacked by a rabid octopus. Someone's been messing with the power conduits. We fix one, another goes dark, Jaren swore under his breath. A little internal sabotage was all they needed, like an extra sprinkling of cyanide on their breakfast cereal. Any idea who? Could be anyone, the engineer said, wiping his greasy hands on an even greasier rag. But it feels deliberate, like someone's trying to stall us. Great, Jaren muttered, rubbing his temples. Just when I thought this couldn't get any worse, Della surveyed the damage with a cool detachment, her eyes flicking to the shadows. Guess this is where our optimism gets a stress test. Jaren's mind raced. They needed to fix this fast before the factions got wind and started pointing fingers, or worse, shooting them. I'll get a security detail down here, Jaren said. We'll need all the eyes we can get. Good luck, Myra said, still hovering with an air of disapproval. You'll need it. Luck's just another word for preparation, Jaren said, turning to Della. Let's find out who's trying to kill us slowly. As they moved through the ship, whispers of sabotage spread like a virus, infecting already fragile alliances. Jaren could feel the tension rising, coiling tighter like a spring ready to snap. Think it's one of yours? Della asked, keeping her voice low as they passed a group of crew members who were arguing loud enough to be heard 2 decks away. Wouldn't rule it out, Jaren said. Desperation makes people stupid. Stupider, Della corrected, earning a weary smile from Jaren. They turned a corner and nearly collided with Trant, who looked like he just crawled through a trash compactor. His usual skepticism was tempered with an edge of exhaustion. Heard about the sabotage, Trant said, falling into step with them. What's the plan? Find the culprit, fix the mess, and try not to let the ship implode, Jaren replied. Simple, simple, Trant echoed, his voice as dry as the Sahara. And here I thought you'd have a complicated plan involving duct tape and prayers. Don't knock duct tape. It's holding this ship together, Della said. They reached the command center, where holo displays flickered with the ship's status, a slow-motion breakdown in real time. The engineers were working overtime to patch things up, but Jaren knew it wouldn't last long without a little miracle. As they gathered around the central console, Jaren couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Someone. An ally in an unlikely place. Then, as if the universe had decided to throw him a bone, a message pinged through the Thrax comm link. It was a single line, cryptic and promising. Help is coming. Jaren blinked, unsure if he was imagining things. We've got a message, he said, more to himself than anyone else. From who? Trant asked, leaning over to peer at the screen. Thrax, Jaren said, scanning the message again. Someone's offering help. Myra, who had followed them like a specter of doom, arched an eyebrow. You trust them? Not a chance in hell, Jaren said. But I'm willing to listen. Desperate times, desperate measures, Della added, her tone laced with sardonic amusement. With little choice and less time, they patched into the Thrax frequency. The holo screen flickered to reveal a Thrax, its features alien yet oddly familiar after years of conflict. Its eyes, however, held something Jaren hadn't expected: sincerity. I am Zelcher, the Thrax said, its voice smooth with a hint of a rasp. You have something we need, and I believe we can help you in return. Help us. Jaren asked, the skepticism thick enough to cut. Why the sudden charity? Zelcher inclined its head, a gesture that was almost human. Survival. Our goals align, at least for now. We need the artifact you possess, and we can deactivate the sabotage in return. Trant shot Jaren a look that could have scorched metal. You believe this? I believe we're out of options, Jaren said, turning back to Zelcher. What do you need from us? Access, Zelcher said simply. Allow us to assist, and we can ensure your systems remain intact. Jaren hesitated, the weight of the decision settling like lead in his gut. Turning to his crew, he saw the same mix of doubt and hope reflected in their eyes. What's it gonna be, Jaren? Della asked, arms crossed. Jaren took a breath, feeling the tightrope of leadership sway beneath him. All right, Zelcher. You've got a deal. But no tricks, Zelcher nodded, the Thrax equivalent of a handshake. No tricks, Captain. We both want to live to see another sunrise. Let us begin. The transmission ended, leaving the room in a tense silence. Jaren could almost hear the collective heartbeat of his crew, synchronized by fear and fragile hope. "Did we just make a deal with the devil?" Della asked, breaking the silence. "Pretty sure the devil would be easier to negotiate with," Jaren replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "But desperate times, right?" Trant's expression was a storm cloud of doubt. "If this goes south, if—" Della interjected with a chuckle. "When it goes south, you mean?" "Let's focus on making sure it doesn't," Jaren said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We've got work to do." The next hours were a blur of activity, each second ticking by with the urgency of a countdown. The Thrax, true to their word, began assisting through the systems, their expertise patching holes that should never have existed. Jaren couldn't shake the feeling that they were balancing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong step and they'd plummet, taking the whole damned ship with them. But as the system slowly stabilized, a cautious optimism began to spread, a virus of hope amidst a petri dish of despair. "Maybe this'll work," Della said, watching the readouts with a glint of something almost like belief in her eyes. "Let's not jinx it," Jaren replied, though he couldn't help but share in the tentative optimism. The sabotage ceased, the power conduits humming with restored energy. Jaren allowed himself a small smile, a crack in the armor of his usual cynicism. "Looks like we've got a fighting chance," Trant said, his voice grudgingly impressed. "We're still alive," Jaren agreed, the words both a victory chant and a reminder of how precarious their situation remained. As the crew settled into a rhythm, Jaren knew this was just the beginning. The Thrax had helped, yes, but the real work was far from over. Together, he murmured to himself, echoing the promise made in fleeting moments of camaraderie. In a universe determined to crush them, they'd found a sliver of light, however dim. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel the fire of defiance that burned within the walls of their battered ship. And as long as that fire burned, they'd keep fighting. "Ready for the next round?" Della asked, snapping him from his thoughts. Jaren grinned, feeling the weight of hope settle beside the burdens of command. "Always." Jaren Vald stared at the holo screen, his gut churning like a blender set to puree. It wasn't every day you made a deal with the same species that had tried to blow you out of a sun's orbit. Then again, desperate times called for alliances that made as much sense as a square wheel. The ship hummed around him, a comforting sound that was as familiar as a lullaby sung by a chain smoker. He glanced over at Della, who was sitting cross-legged on a console, data pad in hand, eternally scrolling through space solitaire. "Think this'll end with us in one piece?" he asked, half joking, fully serious. Della snorted, not looking up. "In this universe, we're more likely to end up as space debris." "That's the spirit," Jaren said, shaking his head. "Glad to see you're keeping the optimism alive." Trant walked in, looking like he'd just crawled out of a swamp of skepticism. "So, we're trusting the squid heads now." "Trust is a strong word," Jaren replied. "I'd call it a mutually beneficial stab in the dark," Trant smirked. "And when they decide to stab us in the front, then we'll at least see it coming," Della said, finally looking up from her screen, eyes twinkling with mischief. The transmission from Zelcher had been a lifeline thrown into a sea of chaos. The Thrax artifact, a piece of alien tech that was as user-friendly as an irritable cobra, was the key to both their dilemmas. Jaren wasn't entirely sure how it worked, but he'd watched enough sci-fi holos to know the red wires were bad news. Myra Bell stood by the doorway, arms crossed tighter than a miser's purse strings. "If this doesn't work, it will," Jaren cut in, more to convince himself than anyone else. "Has to. Otherwise, we're screwed 7 ways to Sunday." The Thrax had sent over their instructions, a series of codes and sequences that looked like a toddler's attempt at modern art. Jaren and the engineers were hunched over the central console, fingers flying over the controls like a pianist on a bender. "Okay, okay," the chief engineer muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of grease that made him look like a raccoon. "I think we've got it." "Think," Myra repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "In this line of work, thinking is as good as it gets," the engineer replied, not missing a beat. "We're about to flip the switch on an interstellar firecracker, and you want guarantees." Jaren gave a nod, more confident than he felt. "Do it." The room held its collective breath as the engineer input the final sequence. The artifact, resting on a makeshift platform, began to hum ominously. Jaren half expected it to sprout legs and run off cackling. Instead, the hum leveled out, the artifact pulsing with a soft, steady light. Jaren exhaled slowly, relief washing over him like a cold shower after a 10-mile run in a heat wave. "Well, it didn't explode," Della said, hopping down from the console. "That's a win in my book." "A low bar, but we'll take it," Trant added, leaning back with a relieved grin. Jaren tapped a few keys, accessing the ship's internal systems. The sabotage was being methodically undone by their new Thrax allies, systems coming back online one by one. If this kept up, they might actually outrun the impending disaster. "Let's get a visual on our friends," Jaren said, pulling up the external cameras. The Thrax ships were retreating, pulling back like a tide ebbing away from the shore. "They're backing off," Della noted, her surprise evident. "Didn't think they had it in them. Maybe they've finally realized their little game isn't worth the candle," Jaren mused, watching the alien vessels disappear into the vast, star-speckled dark. Myra, who had been silent for far too long, finally spoke. "This doesn't mean they won't be back." "Of course not," Jaren said, shrugging. "But we'll be ready. Next time we'll give them a welcome they won't forget." Trant chuckled, a rare sound that was more sandpaper than silk. "Remind me never to piss you off, Captain." "Remind me to make a note of that," Jaren shot back, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. The ship's comm system crackled to life, Zelcher's voice filling the command center. "Our agreement stands," Captain vowed. "We will withdraw as promised." "Appreciate the gesture, Zelcher," Jaren replied, meaning it more than he thought possible. "Let's keep it civil, yeah." The Thrax's alien features flickered on the holo screen, its eyes unreadable. "For now. But know this, human, we will remember your cooperation." "Same here, pal," Jaren said, cutting the transmission with a flick of his wrist. "Let's hope we both stay out of each other's hair, or whatever it is you've got." The room fell quiet again, the end of the conversation leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled by the hum of the ship's systems. They'd pulled it off. Against all odds, they'd managed to survive another day in a universe that seemed hell-bent on their destruction. "All right, people," Jaren said, standing up straighter like a puppet with its strings pulled taut. "We've got a ship to run and a future to cobble together from the scrap. Let's get to it." Della gave him a thumbs up, her grin infectious. "Captain's orders," she announced, heading toward the door. Trant followed, still shaking his head as if he couldn't quite believe they'd pulled it off. "Damn miracle, this crew," he muttered, almost to himself. Myra lingered, her usual stern demeanor softened by a rare, almost imperceptible smile. "You did well, Jaren," she said, her voice full of a grudging respect. "Thanks, Myra," Jaren replied, genuinely touched. "Guess we'll have to keep this ship from falling apart a little longer." "Guess so," she agreed, turning to leave. "Don't get too comfortable. We're not out of the woods yet." Jaren watched her go, the door hissing shut behind her. He took a deep breath, the air heavy with the recycled scent of sweat and victory. It was a heady mix, one he could get used to. "Savor it while you can," he muttered to himself, already feeling the weight of the next challenge pressing down. The endurance was still intact, humanity's last hope clinging to life like a stubborn weed. They'd lived to fight another day, and that was more than he dared hope for. As he turned back to the console, Jaren allowed himself a moment to reflect. They'd forged an unlikely alliance, defied the odds, and, most importantly, survived. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they had. And in a universe that wanted nothing more than to see them fail, that was more than enough. "All right, endurance," Jaren said, hands on the console, the future wide open before them. "Let's see what you've got." The ship responded with a low rumble, a promise of resilience whispered through the metal bones that held them all together. As long as they kept moving forward, there was hope, and Jaren vowed, nominal captain and reluctant optimist, was ready to face whatever came next. Jaren Vald leaned against the console, staring at the holo screen like it owed him money. The hum of the Endurance filled the silence, a constant reminder that they were alive, for now. It wasn't victory, not quite, but it was the closest thing to it. Behind him, Della was still glued to her data pad, fingers twitching over Space Solitaire with the dedication of a gambler down to their last credit. "Think we'll ever have a day without drama?" he asked, half hoping for an optimistic answer, knowing better. Della didn't look up. "Sure, right after we all win the lottery and retire to a tropical moon with low taxes," Jaren chuckled. "A guy can dream." Trant sauntered in, his usual swagger tempered by the recent near-disaster. "This ship ever gonna feel like home, you think?" "Home is where the impending doom is," Jaren replied. "So yeah, sure." Trant smirked, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "Nice to see we're all adapting to the constant threat of annihilation with grace and humor." "Grace and humor," Jaren repeated, nodding. "Two things we're famous for." "Speaking of grace," Della interjected, finally tearing her eyes from the game. "How's the crew reacting to our little collaboration with the Thrax?" "About as well as you'd expect," Trant replied. "Some are convinced it's a sign of the apocalypse. Others think it's a clever ploy to make us all look like idiots." Jaren rubbed his temples. "And here I thought uniting humanity under one banner would be easy. You're forgetting we're a species that can't agree on pizza toppings." Della's tone was dry enough to start a desert. A message pinged on the console, drawing Jaren's attention back to the task at hand. It was from Counselor Myra Bell, her digital signature as imposing as her in-person presence. They had a meeting to prepare for, one that would either help solidify the fragile alliance or shatter it completely. "Time to face the council," Jaren said, glancing at his crew. "Anyone want to take bets on how long before someone throws a chair?" Trant shook his head. "My money's on passive-aggressive jabs and a cold shoulder." "Optimist," Della teased, pushing herself off the console. Jaren led the way to the meeting room, the narrow corridors of the Endurance closing in like the coils of a python. The ship was a relic, a testament to humanity's stubborn unwillingness to let go of what was broken, but for all its flaws, it was still theirs. The meeting room looked like it had been hastily converted from a supply closet, because it probably had been. Representatives from every faction crammed into the too small space, the stifling air thick with anticipation and the scent of recycled perspiration. Counselor Myra Bell stood at the head of the table, her expression as inviting as a spiked pit. "Jaren," she acknowledged, a nod that spoke volumes of her disapproval and reluctant respect. "Myra," he replied, taking his place. Everyone ready to play nice. The murmurs that followed were less than encouraging. The factions aboard the Endurance weren't exactly known for their cooperative spirit. Mistrust was woven into the very fabric of the ship, a tapestry of suspicion and self-interest. "We've got a chance here," Jaren began, cutting through the noise, "to use what we've learned from the Thrax to keep this ship running and maybe, just maybe, get to where we're going in one piece." "Bold words," Myra said, her eyes narrowing. "But I'm not convinced." "We've been burned before, more like incinerated," Trant muttered, earning a few nods from the table. Jaren took a deep breath. "Look, I'm not saying we trust them completely. Hell, I wouldn't trust them to water my space cactus. But we're not exactly swimming in options here." The Engineers Guild representative, a wiry man with hands permanently stained with grease, leaned forward. "Their tech is unpredictable. We're playing with a deck that's missing a few cards, and our own tech is one malfunction away from turning into a floating coffin." Jaren shot back. "We need this. We need each other." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a thick fog. Desperation was a powerful motivator, one that could bend even the most stubborn minds. Della, ever the pragmatist, chimed in. "Unless someone's got a better idea, I suggest we make the most of what we've got. The Thrax may be a risk, but they are a calculated one." Myra's gaze swept the table. "We don't have to like this, but we do have to survive. If we can agree on that, then maybe we have a shot." Reluctant nods followed, a ripple of agreement that felt more like resignation. It wasn't ideal, but then again, nothing ever was aboard the Endurance. As the meeting wrapped up, Jaren caught Myra's eye. Her nod was curt, but it carried a thread of approval that warmed him more than he cared to admit. For all her sternness, she was someone he could rely on, even if she'd never admit the same about him. The factions dispersed, each representative retreating to their corners like boxers after a brutal round. Jaren lingered, Della and Tramp by his side, as the room emptied. "Guess we're doing this," Della said, her tone somewhere between acceptance and a sigh. "Either that or we wait for the next crisis to roll in," Trant added. "And I, for one, am tired of crisis management. Here's to hoping this little experiment doesn't blow up in our faces," Jaren said, failing to keep the sarcasm out of his voice. He watched them leave, the door hissing shut behind them. Alone, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to absorb the gravity of what they were trying to accomplish. It was a gamble, a reckless one, but it was all they had. The ship's archive called to him, a refuge of dusty digital tomes and outdated interfaces. He made his way there, the corridors familiar and oppressive, like a childhood home turned mausoleum. The archives were empty, as they often were, save for the occasional insomniac seeking solace among forgotten knowledge. Jaren settled in, the soft glow of the screens his only company. He sifted through records, piecing together the threads of history that had led them here. The Thrax alliance was a double-edged sword, but it was also a testament to humanity's knack for survival, for finding allies among enemies when the chips were down. It was a legacy of adaptation, of resilience, and as grim as it often was, it was also a beacon of hope. He tapped through ancient treatises and forgotten wars, seeing the same patterns of conflict and cooperation replay across the ages. Humanity had always been a paradox, capable of both incredible destruction and unbelievable unity. In the cold silence of the archives, Jaren found himself reflecting on their journey. They'd come so far, from the brink of extinction to a fragile peace with a former enemy. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was something. The Endurance was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of what they could achieve when they stopped tearing each other apart long enough to build something meaningful. It was a testament to the power of resistance, not through violence, but through stubborn, unyielding hope. As the hours ticked by and the ship sailed through the void, Jaren felt a sense of peace settle over him. They were a long way from safe, but they were moving forward inch by precarious inch. The screen flickered and Jaren caught his reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, lined with worry and resolve. A face that had seen too much, borne too many burdens, but was still here, still fighting. He rose, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. The ship hummed around him, a living entity of metal and will, and he felt a profound connection to its bones and blood. Leaving the archives, Jaren wandered the corridors, passing crew members who nodded or offered weary smiles. There was a camaraderie now, a shared understanding that they were all in this together. Factions be damned, they were united by necessity, by the simple desire to see another day. The command center was quiet when he returned, the lights dimmed to simulate a night cycle that was more ritual than necessity. Della had abandoned her console, leaving behind the faint imprint of a body that had sat too long. Jaren took her place, the seat warm and familiar. He pulled up the ship's logs, reviewing the day's events with a critical eye. It was a mess, but it was their mess, and he felt a strange kind of pride welling up inside him. The Thrax might be unpredictable allies, but they were allies nonetheless, and that was something to hold onto. They'd built a bridge where there had only been chasms before, and in a universe determined to see them fail, that was a victory worth savoring. As the ship sailed on, Jaren allowed himself to hope. Not blindly, not foolishly, but with the kind of practical optimism that had kept them alive this long. Together, they'd face whatever came next, with grit, sarcasm, and the kind of stubborn resilience that defined humanity. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes, letting the gentle vibrations of the ship lull him into a restless sleep. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time it didn't terrify him. In the quiet dark, Jaren Val dreamed of a world where the stars were friends, not foes, and woke with the resolve to make it so.